Catholic School Board's lecture, which is sponsored in part by the three local Catholic boards, the Waterloo District Catholic Board, the Grey Bruce Catholic District School Board, and the Brant Norfolk Catholic District School Board. Given the context as a lecture sponsored by a group of school boards, it's appropriate tonight that we center on local history, and that indeed will be the thrust of tonight's presentation, a talk which will be delivered by a local professor whose name is synonymous with the study of history in this area. Ken McLaughlin, who is a professor of history at St. Jerome's, has co-authored the history of Kitchener with John English. He's written a history of the German settlements in this area, the history of Cambridge and of Waterloo, the foundational history of the University of Waterloo, and has been the intellectual and cultural force lurking behind the history of Hespeler, the Chicopee Ski Club, KW Hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, and God knows how many other books. His interest in the local area has also resulted in his study of Mennonite architecture in Waterloo, which has been published, and he is the historical resource for the Walter Bean Trail. Ken is a native of Hespeler. He received his BA through St. Jerome's, his master's degree at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and his Ph.D. from Toronto. He's been a faculty member here since the early 70s, and he's the director of the Public History Program at the University of Waterloo and the Tri-University Graduate Program in History, jointly offered by UW, WLU, and the University of Guelph. Ken's latest book is co-authored with John English and is a study of Mackenzie King, and in particular, Ken will center in that book on the influence of the local community in the development of the thinking of Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister. That book is due to hit the shelves in 2 weeks. So after you've bought and read your enthusiasm for the truth over the next 2 weeks, you'll be able to line up for this one. The co-author, one of the two co-authors of Enthusiasm for the Truth, is Father Jim Wahl, who was a member of the Congregation of the Resurrection, and who was also a member of the History Department at St. Jerome's, as well as being a past academic dean here. He has served as director of the Legal Studies option, as well as the Medieval Studies option at the University of Waterloo, and has done so for many years. Many of you will know Father Jim from weekend liturgies at UCC, since he is well known for his personable, engaging, and insightful homilies. Others will know him from his challenging courses in the study of law, classical and medieval. Jim has done a considerable amount of research on the history of religion and is recognized as the official historian for his religious order, the Congregation of the Resurrection. He has worked on the translations of the founders of his order, especially Father Eugene Funkin, who established St. Jerome's back in 1865. Some of Father Jim's publications include a brief history of the Congregation of the Resurrection, which appears in a book entitled How Can We Sorrow, which is a study of the resurrection, a recent history of the Diocese of Bermuda, which is a resurrectionist diocese, and that book will appear very shortly, and the letters of Father Eugene Funkin. Jim has also been working on a biographical history of the members of the Congregation of the Resurrection. In addition, Father Wahl has co-authored an outline of medieval history and published a book entitled Immortality in Inalienability, Baldus Ubaldus. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Western Ontario, as well as a master's and doctoral degree from St. Louis University. The third member of the historical trio is Gerald Stortz, who is also a member of our history department. Jerry has a BA and an MA from the University of Waterloo and a PhD from the University of Guelph. Jerry had the happy fortune to be studying under Ken, actually, when Jerry was an undergraduate. Jerry has a keen interest in local history. Have you ever wondered, for example, who writes those historical plaques you find all over the province? Jerry is a prolific member of that research team. He also has an interest in religious history and has published items dealing with the clergy in the Archdiocese of Toronto and the Diocese of Hamilton. Jerry's academic interests also extend to a study of the role of the Irish in our society. He is the co-editor of a 2-volume study of the Irish in Canada entitled Creed and Culture. One volume appropriately covered in green and the other in orange. And while I have the podium, I think it would be only appropriate to mention that there is a silent fourth member of the team who is a member of St. Jerome's staff and who was instrumental in providing the archival materials for Enthusiasm for the Truth. It's our librarian, Carolyn Dirks. I'd see the four of them huddled in the library going over pictures hour after hour after hour. And it's one of the things that makes the book visually so attractive. Carolyn is an archival expert with a library degree from the University of Western Ontario, where she graduated with a distinguished record and academic acclaim. To let you know the order of events for the evening, Father Jim Wahl will comment very briefly on his interest in the history of St. Jerome's. Ken will provide the principal address. The three co-authors will take questions and answers together. And then after my logistical wrap-up, Jerry will conclude with a formal thank you to Ken. So with that, Father Jim Wahl.
Thank you very much, Doug. Fairly obvious that my real interest in this book was probably more about the Congregation of the Resurrection than it was about St. Jerome itself, because St. Jerome is part of the history of our congregation, and I have studied its founding years quite extensively. I was also very happy to be able to introduce to many people some of those pioneers, like Father Louis Funken, Father Theobald Spetz, Father John Fehrenbach, Father Albert Zinger. I'm also very happy that I was able to, in the course of my research and writing, to answer two questions. First of all, how did St. Jerome's get its name? And Ken will talk a little bit about the incident, how that came about. The man whose name it got was Jerome. His last name was Kajszewicz. I've often thought that it would have been nice to have this thing called Kajszewicz College. It had a nice ring to it. And it might have allowed the students in the 19th century to form a Kajszewicz club, with kind of a cheer, Kajsiewicz, which would have been a lot better than the cheer they did have, which was, boomalaka, boomalaka, bow, wow, wow. I was very happy to be able to identify how we got our name. The other point I was very happy to be able to finally solve was, when was St. Jerome born? If you read the book, you will find, of course, at the very beginning we say 1865, but you will find as you go on that they celebrated the Diamond Jubilee, or the Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary, in 1915, appropriately. But they celebrated the Diamond Jubilee, the 75th anniversary, in 1939. And I can recall that when I first joined the staff here, our letterhead had proudly displayed St. Jerome's College, affiliated with the University of Waterloo, founded in 1864. We finally got that changed. So for those very reasons, I was very happy to be part of the writing of this book, and I hope you all enjoyed reading it.
I'm very pleased to see you all here this evening, because at the end of the term and early in December, one has a doubt that anyone would come out on a snowy evening to hear about a college that many of you probably think you already know all too much about. I think I should say at the beginning, however, that Father Jim Wahl was too modest. He contributed much more than those two things, and without his early research into the history of the congregation, we would have been really hard-pressed to do the book. And Jerry Stortz's own research was dealing with a central figure in the history of St. Jerome's who often goes unnoticed, because in some ways he comes out as kind of a villain in our history, and that's Bishop Joseph F. Ryan. Bishop Ryan was really responsible after St. Jerome's had suspended its operation during the Great Depression, and without Bishop Ryan's determination, I'm not sure whether St. Jerome's would have been renewed as it was, and it was certainly Bishop Ryan who pushed for a university in the Diocese of Hamilton. And he also, I'm way ahead of myself, but I'm going to deal with Bishop Ryan quickly. He started a major fundraising campaign which people even of my generation can remember, and he collected money for St. Jerome's, And it was so successful that he thought, why don't we collect money for Catholic education? Or why don't we just collect money? And so St. Jerome's got a very small amount of the proceeds, which numbered in the millions, and we got 250,000, leaving us with a massive debt, and the bishop thinking that he had really contributed to our success. Well, indeed, in a way he had, in a way he hadn't. But I want to lay that one out for you first, because Bishop Ryan is in some ways really responsible for sort of the modern identity of St. Jerome's. But he's also kind of a villain, because he kept the money back and left us with a terrible debt, and he didn't approve of joining the University of Waterloo. And he kept saying, you're going to make a terrible mistake here, and this is our only chance. If you guys make this do this wrongly, we'll never recover. So there's a lot of really interesting byplay in this book, and I thought I wanted to put some of those names before you. What I'm going to do tonight is give a brief introduction to some of the elements like this that I think are controversial or fun or of interest, and then I'm going to look at some slides with you on PowerPoint, and then, as Jim suggested, we actually have some quotes from the book which we like to look at those incidents in more detail, which will give you a sense of the kind of documentary and textual analysis in the book. I think they're rather fun to read, but as an historian, I'm not comfortable reading out loud. We prefer to talk, but not read. English professors read, as did Professor Letson, much better than we historians do. So if I stumble over the reading, it's because that's not really my forte. It's the actual story of St. Jerome's, however, that I want to deal with. So it's always difficult to know how to prepare one of these lectures, because you're never sure who in the audience will know the background fully, who I'll be repeating things that they've already heard before, and who in fact doesn't really have the basic information. And so if I go too far too fast, I'm missing everyone's. And given the local history topic, it's always incredibly dangerous, because there are people in the audience who inevitably know more than the authors. That's just the way local history is, as I've learned for the last 30-odd years. I'm going to try and set out then the parameters within which I want to deal with the book. The book is nearly 300 pages long, so I obviously can't do the whole story of St. Jerome's this evening. I want to start, though, by telling you about what happened to me in June. In June, I was asked to speak to the Canadian Catholic Historical Association in Toronto. There was a major session at the University of Toronto on the writing of university histories, and having been not quite finished this, but it was in a finished enough state that they asked if I would come and speak about St. Jerome's to that audience. And what I talked about that day was what seemed to me to be a really critical part of what I call the modern history of St. Jerome's, and that is the kind of issues faced by St. Jerome's in 1959. To me, that's still modern, although for some people in this audience, it's already getting sort of old history. 1959, St. Jerome severed its ties with the University of Ottawa, with which it was then affiliated and through which it was giving out degrees. It severed its ties with the University of Ottawa and instead joined what was really an unknown, non-existent university to be established in Waterloo. That's a controversial decision. A lot of people were unhappy with that. A lot of people in the Congregation of the Resurrection were unhappy with that. Ottawa was a prominent Roman Catholic university. Why wouldn't one stay associated with it? Why join an upstart university that really didn't even exist? A fairly gutsy decision that was taken in 1959, and not taken without some controversy, and in the book we actually do address some of that. Not only did they leave the University of Ottawa and join in a new university, but they became a founding college, the founding college of the University of Waterloo. And part of the answer is that without St. Jerome's, the University of Waterloo politically may not have been able to be formed. The Premier at that time, Leslie Frost, was adamant that for a university to be created, they needed the support of the community. In fact, they needed the support of St. Jerome's. And without that support, he was really reticent about moving the University of Waterloo forward. Not only did St. Jerome's join the University of Waterloo, untried and non-existent at that moment, in 1974 we also reached full provincial funding, in which case we became a fully funded provincial university. And that has its own set of implications, and I think we need to understand something of that as well. Interestingly, however, those very changes occurred at the same time as within the Roman Catholic Church the Vatican Council had been convened. When we opened this college in 1962 on this campus, Pope John XXIII was convening the Second Vatican Council at about the same moment. and the changes that that would bring to the Catholic Church and to universities that were Roman Catholic was profound. So St. Jerome's is becoming part of a new university, very different from the University of Ottawa, at the very time when the Church itself was going through profound changes. So I want to look at, in part, and in the book we try to look at what those changes meant for us as a university, what they meant for the community, what they meant for lay leadership, because our board chairs are now lay men, or lay women actually, what it means for the faculty and staff of St. Jerome's, our dean, our president, our lay men at this point in time, how those changes occurred, not without some controversy, not without some crisis either, but they're part of a really difficult changing times. And I speculate in the book, at least in my part of the book, that we were incredibly fortunate in doing what we did when we did, and the notion that Bishop Ryan had coming out of World War II, for example, was for a very different kind of university. It was one that I would say looked to the past for its direction, and interestingly, I think the kind of university we became is one that looks to the future for its direction. Fortuitous, because I don't propose for a minute that everyone had that kind of foresight, but I think fortuitously the kind of university that we became was really one that was indeed appropriate for the time, an ecumenical age, an age in which lay people had to take on responsibilities, an age in which this center, St. Jerome's Center for Catholic Experience, is formed and plays a major role in the larger community, a role that in 1962 we probably couldn't have anticipated. But I also want to look at the roles that St. Jerome's has played over its 137 years, because the next thing I want to say is we're a very old university, or a very old college. 137 years. St. Jerome's is actually one of the oldest post-secondary institutions in Ontario. It's a history that we know very little about. We know a lot about it now, I suspect, or maybe after tonight, or after you all buy the book, you'll know a lot about it. No, you have to read the book. Then you'll know a lot about it. I understand buying the books isn't the same as reading them. I understand that because that's what I often do. I have a lot that I haven't read. I want to talk a bit about our past history as well, because even over dinner tonight we were talking about changes in the roles of presidents and what presidents do, talking with Doug Letson, and I was saying it's really interesting because when you look back at Father Louis Funken, when you look back at Father Theobald Spetz, you look back at Father Albert Zinger, those past presidents all took very active roles in the community after their term as president of St. Jerome's, that there is a long history of that kind of involvement in the community, and it's something that's both expected and understood. So, a lot of things to talk about, a lot of themes. Let me just see if I can get them organized into a way that would be meaningful for all of us. One of the things that I want to say in introduction was that a few weeks ago, my wife and I were in England on sabbatical, and we were on a tour in England looking at museums and other ways of understanding history. And while we were in England, the Booker Prize was announced. And the Booker Prize is probably the most prestigious prize given to new authors annually. It was a coincidence, but a fortunate one, that we were actually staying with Lady Una Bishop, whose husband, Sir George Bishop, had been the chairman of Booker's. And we used to often talk about why did Booker's, which is a large company, decide that they wanted to donate a prize for literature. And this year the prize was won by a Canadian. And when Booker's were talking about the prize in the beginning, they said the influence of ideas is critical in our society. So too is an understanding of the human condition. That's why a company like Booker's is keen to support a prize in literature. And then we talked about St. Jerome's, and I said, ironically, St. Jerome's will never be nominated for a Booker Prize, but St. Jerome's in its own way deals with understanding the human condition. That's in fact primarily what it's about. It also offers us a way to better understand ourselves as a community and as a society. So in a way, all of this kind of literature and this kind of research has a more general importance than simply learning a body of facts or details about a particular institution. So let me give you a quick synopsis of St. Jerome's, then we'll look at the slides, and I'll keep my eye on the clock so that we don't run over time. First of all, some information about St. Jerome's University, because I know from my own experience that even though I was a student here 40 years ago, when I first came, and I find that shocking and hard to believe, but I did the calculation, it's more than 40, but I won't tell you how many more than 40. but it's at least more than 40 years ago. I didn't understand anything about St. Jerome's. I simply knew that it was a Catholic college and that many people in the diocese had supported it. My parents had taken me to see it, and they're really proud of the existence of St. Jerome's at that point in time. But I knew nothing more than that about its history. But of course, in 1961, it was a new building by Fairview Park Shopping Mall, not the St. Jerome's that's here, not the one that's in Kitchener, downtown, but yet another St. Jerome's. And we'll be looking at the history of those St. Jerome's too, which may explain in part the sense of identity, or the lack of identity. Well, what exactly is St. Jerome's University? And let me put that into a context. First of all, since 1967, St. Jerome's is a full member of the Association of Universities and Colleges in Canada. It's a full-fledged university by right. It's also a member of the Association of Catholic Universities and Colleges in Canada. You could drop that off fairly quickly, except that St. Jerome's former president, Norman Choate, was one of those keenly responsible for creating that organization. So we played a major role not just in being a member, but actually getting the other Catholic universities together. Choate was in fact his first president. St. Jerome's is also a full member of the International Federation of Catholic Universities, and the president and the dean are tonight in Rome at a meeting of IFCU with all the other, not with all the other, but with many other international Catholic universities. And when I think of that, I think, Louis Funken, going back to 1865 in St. Agatha, would probably be astounded. He certainly would be proud that his little college from the backwoods of Upper Canada has its representatives in Rome dealing with major issues about university education. I want to say, too, that getting that far as a member of the International Federation is not easy. It's not clear sailing. Some of Father Louis' difficulties we'll talk about in a minute. Nor was the support of the leadership of his own Congregation of the Resurrection always behind him. In fact, sometimes they were not supportive of Father Louis, nor were they supportive of St. Jerome's. So St. Jerome's has had its history, and I think it's important that we measure that. Sometimes we think history is going to be just black and white. It's all moving forward. History is very often fought out in areas that are gray. There are decisions that are taken that some will agree with and some will disagree with, and I think that's an understanding of what the human condition really is. Those who disagreed with Louis had their reasons. Those who supported him had their reasons. It's a measure of that, but to deny that there were problems and to think, oh yes, this is always the way the university will come. I see the slide has done something, but I'm not going to worry yet. When it goes blank and the big blue screen comes up, that's when we worry. At the moment, it's just saying resume the slideshow. Well, we'll be starting it in a minute. We tried to look at difficulties to be fair-minded both ways, and that's one of the things that I think history should do. It should say to you, yeah, there are problems and there are issues, and you have to understand the debate. You can agree or you can disagree, but sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's chance, sometimes it's good fortune, sometimes it's the economy, the social issues. But to assume that any university will just keep moving forward is not a fair assumption. Universities have had very different and very difficult histories in this country. We don't often see that because they do seem to survive, and we think that's the way it should be. St. Jerome's was incorporated by an act of the provincial legislature in 1866. St. Jerome's has been at the provincial legislature getting its charter amended many times, as recently as last year. So there's also a separate legal judicial history of St. Jerome's as a separately incorporated university in the Ontario system. We're not separate from that at all. We give out our own degrees, or we could, that is. We do not give out our own degrees. We give out the University of Waterloo degrees through a federation agreement, but the degrees for St. Jerome's students are also bestowed upon them by the Chancellor of our university, along with the Chancellor of the University of Waterloo and the Vice Chancellor. So we actually have a role in that convocation. The other issue that has hindered and bothered many people is, what about St. Jerome's High School? Are you going to write about St. Jerome's High School in this book? Did you write about it? Will you write about it? How do you separate the two? How do you keep them together? An interesting issue that we dealt with throughout the entire history, because for most of the time there's been one history, the history of St. Jerome's College, subsumed within it the history of St. Jerome's High School. They were one and the same. They had a president, the president of St. Jerome's College, who was also de facto the president of St. Jerome's High School. only in 1953. So from 1865 to 1953, the president of St. Jerome's College also was the president of the high school, and the curriculum was taught conjointly in some ways. There was a separate curriculum for those intending to pursue a higher degree, although we couldn't give out a degree, through St. Jerome's College. But students who were attending high school said they were going to St. Jerome's College. But it sort of reminds me of other places that have a college school attached to a university. The college school is the prep school for the university. 1953, when St. Jerome's built its new campus at Kingsdale, they separated the two functions. A principal of the high school was created for the first time, and the head of the new St. Jerome's College was called a rector, because that was the nomenclature used by the University of Ottawa. When we rejoined the University of Waterloo, the head of St. Jerome's once again became a president. It was the president of the University of St. Jerome's College, and the high school principalship remained separate. But for that first nearly 100 years, those histories are totally intertwined. So images of one very often are images of both, rather than of one or the other. So let's have a quick look at these images that are on the screen. Now you've got the whole thing displayed. I'll have to figure out how to restart it with the help of Carolyn. I'm not technically literate enough to do this. Or we could just look at them in miniatures. That would do it too. Okay. If I stay here, this is not going to block. I have a portable microphone, but I could stay right here and do it too. Okay, maybe I better just move slightly away. The cover picture and the title, Enthusiasm for the Truth, comes from a letter. The title, at least, I think I have to move back. I'm going to catch the speakers. The title comes from a letter from Father Louis Funkin to the bishop, in which he said he wanted to create a college in which he would instill in his students enthusiasm for the truth. Hence, that was one of Father Wahl's earlier findings in his research. Hence the title for our book, Enthusiasm for the Truth. One of my colleagues said to me, well, why didn't you call it Passion for the Truth? I said, because Father Funkin chose enthusiasm for the truth, and I thought that was entirely appropriate. Someone said to me tonight, well, which truth are you going to talk about? And that's not totally a facetious question, because indeed the perceptions of truth, the perceptions of what the education should produce, should provide, do change over time. The priorities we would be seeking to investigate are different. Last week, the Record in an interview said to me, well, what would you say is the purpose now of a Catholic college like St. Jerome's? And I said, well, we have to have all the academic credibility of the university, but we want to go beyond that. We want to incorporate ideas of spirituality as well. That's part of our quest of knowledge of the human condition. I think that's also what Father Funkin had in mind. I think both times, through most of his curriculum that we look at, you'll find that balance is there. The picture is taken from late 1960s by the Volkswagen on the cover. There's also buildings missing. People say that can't be the library there, because if you stand out here and take a line, how did you do that? That's because Needles Hall wasn't built at that point, and the camera sort of telescoped the image, but that clearly is the image of, look at the size of the trees, which is what always fascinated me. And I always liked that picture because it also shows us coming into St. Jerome's by Notre Dame Chapel. It seemed to me in many ways that was a striking image. St. Jerome's in the heart of the university, clearly situated in the center, but also with its own entry point, and Notre Dame Chapel being that entrance. This one is is a photograph of the installation of our most recent Chancellor, Richard Gwynne. For this installation in March last year, I guess it's March this year, we're not last year yet. It seems like last year. In March we went to St. Agatha, to the historic founding of St. Jerome's, to the church in St. Agatha for the installation, and I thought it was really appropriate to do that and to go back to the installation. I think it's equally interesting to see, standing beside Chancellor Gwynne, designate Chancellor, is chairman of our board, who is a woman, Deborah Pekoski, who is also a graduate of St. Jerome's. That our board chair is a woman, that our board chair is a graduate of St. Jerome's speaks volumes about the kind of educational change that we've undergone in the 1960s. In the 1950s, students at St. Jerome's were all men, mainly all clerical. So to have this photograph representing that, I thought said rather a lot about it. Just beyond Sanster Gwyn is actually Father Norman Choate, who had come back for the installation, and it does do some connections. Next to Deborah Pekoski is, of course, Michael Higgins, our president, and Kieran Bonner, our dean. Now we're stepping even further back into the history of St. Agatha. It's actually further back in the history of the Funken family. This photograph was taken in 1862. It's at the ordination of Father Louis Funken, who will be the founder of St. Jerome's. Sitting beside him is his brother Eugene, and standing in the middle is his other brother Julius. I think it's really fascinating to be able to actually get photos like that, thanks to our archives, and thanks to the Congregation of the Resurrection who donated those photos to the archives. We have a richly illustrated history of images that I thought would probably never be possible. I mean, I just like thinking about Eugene came over to Canada as a missionary, and he persuaded his brother Louis to come with him. And Louis came after finishing a doctorate in Rome, and came with him with the idea of the need for a college or a university to serve the Catholic community. The recognition of the need wasn't just with the Funkens. The Bishop of Hamilton had thought of that earlier. He tried to persuade the Jesuits to do it, but it's with the brothers Funken that the idea becomes real, the embryo of a college called St. Jerome's, which we'll talk about in a minute from the documents. And of course that is, I don't know why I said of course only because I've seen it so often, that is the original log cabin which was rented by Father Funken, the origin of St. Jerome's, just outside the boundaries today of St. Agatha, the village of St. Agatha. And the donors of that photograph are here, but I won't embarrass them. But I heard that there was a photograph, and I was so pleased to get it, because so often we'd had a kind of a line drawing, and everything looked so clean and so pure and so proper. The building didn't have running water, the building was too small. How could you really begin a college in a building that size? Obviously one couldn't, and within a year, Father Louis Funken decided it was important to move to Berlin, where he could get a larger room and a larger building, and also where there were larger opportunities for a college. And that's the building that he established in Berlin in 1866. That photograph is probably from, I would think, the mid-1870s. I love the photograph of the students on the roof, because we often think of students and pranks as being a 21st century now. 19th century, they were up to it as well. And a lot of the photographs we took, we noticed they always were on the roof. You see the ladder at the back. That is because of the problems of fire. And if a roof were to catch fire, open fires and sparks, they almost always had access to the roof. But that also meant the students had access to the roof. I think a lot of the early photos in the book, you'll see that particular veranda is the background for the photos when Father Funken and his graduating classes would assemble for a photo. But that's the larger picture of the building. I find it really fascinating how good those photographs are and how much detail you can get. This is St. Jerome's in Berlin in 1889. It's the end of Father Louis Funken's era, which is why I put this one in. But you can see the evolution of St. Jerome's to that point in time. It was a major presence in the town of Berlin. We often forget that, assuming it must have just been a small little school. In the Berlin of its day, St. Jerome's was a major institutional presence. And we chose that photograph to go on the inside cover because it's so striking and the details are so visible. And the playing fields and the boardwalks, and those are really, gives you a real sense of Berlin. I often think what it would have been like to have been a student. We've tried in the book to capture student life during each of these eras. And this is the student newspaper, Alumni magazine from 1889. And again, it's the image of St. Jerome's that I chose, that one, so I will put that next so you'd actually see it. And in the book we will talk more, I mean maybe even tonight if I get a chance, talk a bit more about student life and how it changed over time. There's an example of the study room. You compare it to our study rooms with computers and laptops and electronics. This is inkwells and I don't know whether they're quill pens, I rather doubt it, but it's a very different study era from the present. And I think that's George Washington's photograph. Many of our students had come up from the United States, and I'm sure that's Washington. I kind of laughed and thought how interesting in terms of CNN's dominance that even in these days there was an American presence. I like this one too. It's the Siegfried Hall of its day. This is Siegfried Hall tonight. This was Siegfried Hall in 1897. St. Jerome's students did a lot of literary and dramatic presentations. Sometimes they would do presentations like that to raise money for the St. Agatha Orphanage. Students in those days were as keen to reach out to the community as our students in our day. And that's gas lighting that you see hanging down from the ceiling, and I could not, even with a closer look, figure out what the photographs were. But I thought, how interesting we're looking at this in this room tonight and looking at that room of more than 100 years ago. But the sense was that St. Jerome's had an obligation to reach out to its community then as it is today. So not everything changes. This changes though, Carolyn. This is the library, 1905, old building. Pool table we don't have in our library, that's changed. The gas lighting. We have the same kind of books, however. We have some of those same books, I suspect. The University of Waterloo library system, though, of which we're part electronically connected to, has 7.7 million books or volumes. I don't think there were 7,000 or even 700 in those days. It's an interesting statement of the time. And this is the St. Jerome's building that most of you would recognize as St. Jerome's College. Most people recognize this one. We've had a real identity issue because we kept trying to say we're St. Jerome's College, and people said to me recently, did you go to St. Jerome's College? Did you write about St. Jerome? This is what they meant, not here. And I had to say, no, I went to Preston High School, so I was safe on that one. This is a photograph taken from the mid-1930s, but the building itself dates from 1908, 1909. And I think of this in some ways as St. Jerome's College. And then I say, well, of course, we're St. Jerome's University. But the notion of that prominence of that building as a dominant feature of Kitchener's architecture has remained to the present. I think Kitchener's New City Hall has the color of sandstone that it does, so it blends with that building. And if you go out the rear exit of the New City Hall, you're struck by the way that building is framed and how dominant it still is. This is the other St. Jerome's. St. Jerome's has a tradition of new, and the sign would have said the new St. Jerome's. This is 1953. This is Kingsdale. It's beyond Dare Cookies, but before Fairview Plaza. And this was the St. Jerome's College from 1953 to 1962 when we came here. That's the opening of it, and I just put that to juxtapose to the older building. This is to be the modern look of a university circa 1953. It's really interesting because each set of architecture is dated by the time it was built. Now we have the new, another new, and in the book we've actually got those brochures that say the new St. Jerome's, and then the next new St. Jerome's. This is our site on this campus as it looked in 1960. Pretty barren. How can you imagine that you create a university? So when I talked about there being criticism of Father Siegfried, for example, for wishing to join this new untried university, and when people took a look at that, I think you can understand why there were people who were doubting it, who said that's not a really good thing to do. Better stay with the University of Ottawa, the one we know. And the two men who brought this university together, Father Siegfried and Dr. Hagee, suspicious of each other at the beginning and good friends by the end. And both of them identified now as the founders of the University of Waterloo. And that's the way the campus looked when St. Jerome's was being built. And even today people are saying, oh, that's Renison College, that's Renison, and that's St. Jerome's. And you can see how early we were on the campus. I mean, we really were founders of the new university. The major revolution was women. Sister Leon said that it was a new frontier, and she was absolutely right. The presence of women co-eds on campus in 1962 was a dramatic change for this university and especially for St. Jerome's. St. Jerome's had said as early as 1947, that we were going to have women as members of St. Jerome's. It never happened. I think in 1955 there was one. In 1959-60, when we were planning to come to the university and the arrangement had already been identified, there were 13. Once St. Jerome's moved here, it was a dramatic change, and it meant a change for the local community, people who could send their children, their daughters, to St. Jerome's and not have to send them off elsewhere for university education. By 1973, this is how they looked. They had not only transformed their hairstyles, but also the presence of the university. These are some of Professor Letzon's students. I can identify them as in another picture, sitting in his office talking to him, but we can, if I put Professor Letzon's picture up from that era, you would also see a different looking Doug Letson, so we'll just skip through that. He's paid me to not do that tonight. I want to go back now to some of the founders, some of the builders of St. Jerome's. Father Albert Zinger is this one. It's hard to know how much to say tonight, but let me just say a couple of things about Father Zinger. He's particularly responsible for a number of major projects in this community. One of them would be, I think, the new St. Mary's Church, which was new then, because St. Mary's Church, as we know it, was built in 1903. It's not the original St. Mary's. Father Zinger, after he left St. Jerome's College, was clearly responsible for getting St. Mary's Hospital on track, and in the history of that institution, he's identified prominently as a major spokesman for the hospital after he retired as president. As president of St. Jerome's, he did many things that changed the look, the curriculum, and the face of St. Jerome's. One of the things I'd like to mention tonight, which may be not quite what you'd expect, 1914, when the First World War broke out, this community was really badly torn by ethnic division. Father Zinger did two things. One of them was he gave a major patriotic address which put St. Jerome's College and the Roman Catholic community strongly behind the Canadian effort in the war. As you may know, other religious groups in this community were badly split on this one. Father Zinger's patriotic address was much quoted. He had also collected money for an expansion of St. Jerome's and building on a new campus. That money went into the war bonds and not into expanding the campus. In many ways, it struck me that he did the right thing, but if you're writing the history of St. Jerome's, you might have said, wouldn't it have been great if we got a new campus in 1917? I wonder what would have happened. Because instead of that, St. Jerome's stays on, now in a campus that's going to be too small where it can't really develop. So as I said in the beginning, there are always matters of gray. There's not just a clean black and white decision. But there's no question that as a community leader, this former president of St. Jerome's was a major player. This is Father Cornelius Siegfried, known to his friends as Cork, who led in the direction of change, bringing St. Jerome's from Kingsdale into a modern university. The community was divided. The bishop was not altogether supportive, indeed was fairly critical of Father Siegfried. I think it was a fairly risky thing that he did. I don't know that he really understood how great the risks were. It was also at a time when the Congregation of the Resurrection was strapped financially, and there was a major debt load to take this initiative to come here. On the other hand, I think he had very few other choices, but it's a really interesting story. In this one, we actually have his letters and Dr. Hagee's letters and the whole inside story about that decision, the difficulty, and the risks that they were taking. And this president is Douglas Letson. I chose this photo for a number of reasons, but just for tonight, for the purpose of tonight, it picked up a pattern of former presidents of St. Jerome's being active in the community. What the photo shows is, of course, the first president who was not a Roman Catholic priest. And I said, how better to symbolize that than to bring in his wife Donna, who's standing beside Doug, his daughter Cheryl on the one side and Nadine on the other, and his son Rick. The very image of a family present to support the president on his installation says far more than any chapter in the book about clerical and lay leadership. This is a really symbolic shift for St. Jerome's, and not one that came about all that easily. As a former president, Doug Letson is now, of course, on the board of St. Mary's Hospital. He's on the board of the Walter Bean Trail, in which he's president. He's on the Community Foundation. He's playing an active leadership role in the community, in no small way, in part because of the many contacts he made as president of St. Jerome's, and equally, I think, of the commitment of St. Jerome's to play a role in the community. It's something that you can trace back to Funkin, and you can bring forward to Doug Letson. It's a really interesting theme, which is part of a university's history. It's not just what we do in the classroom. Michael Higgins' installation as president. of course, Michael's in Rome tonight representing St. Jerome's in Europe, so maybe the role of president is far more than we've sometimes thought. I wanted this photo because the board chair in Michael's installation is Mark Wahl, another St. Jerome's graduate, who also became chair of the board, and of course a prominent woman in the local community. Sitting next to her is Karen Bonner, our present dean, and next to him, looking pensively, is Martin Vallely, who is the bishop's representative on our board. So it struck me that this one photo says a lot about the present development and place of St. Jerome's in the community. And before I forget it, Father Martin Vallely is also a graduate of St. Jerome's College. So these photographs tell you a lot more about the community and about our role than at first glance you might expect. And on the far side is Christina Vannon, who is also a graduate of St. Jerome's College and a professor here. John Sweeney, who didn't graduate from St. Jerome's, but the first lay person to be Chancellor of St. Jerome's. And it would be impossible to tell the history without talking briefly about John. Richard Gwynn, our newly installed Chancellor at his installation. And then I'm switching now to a set of slides which really just, they were like a scrapbook. I'm not wanting to interpret them for you, but merely to say, St. Jerome's has always had a tradition of reaching out for the community. This is the annual charity run, which has gone on for, I think was it 25 years we celebrated? I think so. It's in the book anyway, you have to check the footnotes. A long time for an institution to continue giving back something to the community, which is the thesis behind it. The presence of the liturgy, when people were wondering about St. Jerome's as a Roman Catholic institution, I could think of a few better images than to pick up this one, which brings the whole community of students and the larger community together for an outdoor liturgy, the priest celebrating his Father. I won't say anything about the back of men's heads at our age. It's not a safe thing to talk about. That's Father Alex Macaulay, an interesting photo because Alex came in as chaplain. The woman sitting beside him is Tony DeLabio, who was the first director of campus ministry. Woman director of campus ministry. When that decision was made, a lot of people said, how can that be? How could you possibly have a woman as a director of campus ministry? Isn't Alex the priest? Of course, now I don't think anyone would even think anything about it, but at the time there was a lot of whispering. That was a very risky thing to do, you know. I don't think it is, but it shows how times have changed. And two peer ministers, which we still have, not those two, but students as peer ministers. I'm just picking this up to talk about, in my scrapbook of students, you can't write a history of a university without students. You can write about buildings, you can write about presidents. If you don't write about students, it's not a university. I took this one back because it's laying of a cornerstone of what became the edition that we identify with St. Jerome's, but what I like about it is the man in the fedora, Father Theobald Spetz. We haven't said much about Father Spetz, but let me just give you the scenario quickly. He was the inheritor of Father Funken's tradition. He maintained the tradition of Louis Funken, but he's his own man, as you can tell by the fedora standing there. Clearly his own man. When he stepped down as president of St. Jerome's College, you know what he did? He founded a parish called St. Louis in Waterloo, named in part because of his affection for Father Louis Funken. And he found that the problems of creating a new parish in Waterloo and also remaining on as president of St. Jerome's were simply impossible. But he remained on as a president, as an active member of the faculty. And during the same First World War, Father Spetz became really involved in the debate about the name change, significantly because he identified us, St. Jerome's tradition at least, with Canada, with the German-Canadian community. After all, Spetz's ancestors had come here in 1829. They were among the very first of that group of German-speaking Roman Catholics. It was natural that he would articulate that identity, and there's a wonderful section in the book about the First World War and the challenges that we faced as a college and as a community. Other universities were much more hardly hit by anti-German sentiment than St. Jerome's, but St. Jerome's is sitting here in the middle of a German-speaking community. a community in which soldiers were on the street with bayonets fixed to settle riots. How is it that St. Jerome survives unscathed? In no small measure because of the role of presidents like Albert Zinger and Theobald Spetz, who identify clearly with the Canadian community. There are other reasons as well, but actually the soldiers played sports with the St. Jerome's College students. Rather than try to hassle them or hector them into joining, they actually engaged in competitive sports. They used the St. Jerome's facilities, they used our new gym, they used our swimming pool. Of all the problems that occurred in here, the one area that wasn't a problem, ironically, was the one that in most communities was a tinderbox, was relation between 118th Battalion and St. Jerome's. So there's a whole interesting subset to that photo as well. And of course the statue of Father Louis Funkin, erected in 1907, it's an image in this community that everyone identifies, and it would be wrong of me not to at least have mentioned it tonight. For a time we hoped we'd get it here on our campus, but I think we're all happy where it is at St. Mary's Church. But there was a moment in time when we thought, wouldn't it be nice to actually move it here? I think it's best where it is, in the center of Kitchener. Well, Fourth of Knights of Columbus are everywhere when there's a symbolic event, and here they are at the opening of the Kingsdale campus. Premier Leslie Frost is there, lots of the members of the congregation. And for those who are here tonight, in the book there's a caption that says, many of the priests were wearing their straw bowlers before Tilley's hats were invented. If we had this photograph today, I'm sure that Tilley's hats would be as prominent as straw hats. But it's just, I'm looking at the picture and thinking about the time. The Kingsdale Chapel, which was also a parish, which was also symbolic. When you read about the 1950s in our history, you'll talk about the renewed vocations coming out of the Second World War and the importance of this building and the Kingsdale campus in dealing with what was clearly a major issue after the war. Late vocations, belated vocations, and the tremendous pressure to become seminarians going through Kingsdale. This is the opening of St. Jerome's campus here in 1962. Two things of interest, there are many things of interest. Father Ralston, who was a very prominent member of the community, along with Bishop Ryan and Father John Finn. But I also like the upper gallery with the Sister Loretto of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and look at the habit she's wearing. The habits also go through a major and radical change once they come on campus, but that one still reflects the old period and the length of the skirts and the kerchiefs, because if those young girls had just been at a church service, they have to wear something on their heads. Sometimes just a Kleenex with a bobby pin, but sometimes it was more. But anyway, social history is fascinating. We start looking at things we did and things we believed and wonder sometimes why. No bobby pin and no... Nicholas Fisher made it because of his hairstyle, pure and simple. He was a student at St. Jerome, so also came back to teach part-time. Wonderful photo. When we saw that one in the archives, we said, it's in, doesn't matter what else is in. Nicholas Fisher makes it, and he spells his name in the right way, local way, the German spelling of Fisher. William Motes made it as well. Very different reasons. One of our most prominent alumni, and the continuing prominence of the Motes family and their place at St. Jerome's is significant. I also liked his mustache. I like the little mustache with the tweaks in the end. In the book there's much more about Motes and his role. One of the things that's interesting is that Julius Funkin in Holland, who got the Berliner Journal, Motes' newspaper, said his paper really reflected the philosophy of Father Louis Funkin. You could go back and read it and see, but I suspect if you did, you'd find out as much about William Motes as you might find out about Louis Funkin. There is we try to often measure our role as teachers, and it's very difficult. When something like that happens, it's kind of rewarding for all of us to think that maybe we have an influence beyond what we think. The three deans, Father Ralston, Father Jim Wahl coming in as dean, and Father John Finn. John was dean first, then Zach, and then Jim. Anyone who remembers those three on campus at the same time, I think, has a warm feeling when you look at that photo. And when you look at this one, there's always a warm feeling when you think of John Finn on campus. It's hard not to feel a sense of affection for him. And there's a wonderful feature in the book about his retirement dinner when he hid, and they had to drag him up. But that's not the first time. It's fairly common when Father Finn was being honored to him not to want to go on the stage. He was hiding in the back of the room, and then they had to come and get him. He had to sit beside his mother and his brother, who trapped them on the stage. And then he gave a really witty speech where he did a parody on each of our disciplines. And from that, you had the sense that not much escaped his eye. He may have wanted to hide out, but he also had a really clear sense of what was going on. I put this one in because it's a school board lecture and it's part of the center, and I wanted us to think about St. Jerome Center. This is the 20th anniversary of the center this year. The number of speakers that we've had, the number of important talks that have come through St. Jerome's, and the fact this one is reaching out to high school students, bringing them here to St. Jerome's, both talks about the speakers and about the import and about the relationship to St. Jerome's to its larger community. And then I wanted to go back again just to think for a moment about what it was like in 1865 to try to create a college in the backwoods of Upper Canada in this environment. And then I want to end here. I'm watching the clock and realizing that the time is going quickly. Father Wahl said I should say something about the naming of St. Jerome's, and I promised to do that. I actually have a whole text, which I promised to myself I wouldn't read, so I guess I'd better not. Let me just tell you about the naming of St. Jerome's, where the name came from, and it will give you an illustration of the kind of documents that are in the book. In the actual letters from Father Funken, there is no place where he talks about calling it St. Jerome's College. So as Jim was saying, there's always this question, well, where did the name come from? For the first 6 months, it was simply called Wilmot College, and there are actually documents with the name Wilmot College on it, because it's in Wilmot Township. In July 1860, this is taken right out of the text of the book. In July 1865, Father Jerome Kasewitz, the Superior General of the Congregation of the Resurrection, arrived in Canada West on his first official visit. In Berlin, where he met with Father Breitkopf, the pastor of St. Mary's Church, Father Jerome was greeted by horsemen from St. Agatha, who were there to escort him to their village, and it was a memorable journey. This is from his letter at the time. Quote, he said, "Honors have accompanying disadvantages, because I ate my fill of dust, stirred up by 20 horses galloping down the road for 2 whole hours. The Catholic population took off work, came out of their homes in their best clothes, kneeling to seek my blessing. Over everything the bells rang out. When I saw the procession coming up from St. Agatha to meet me, I got down from the coach. Father Louis Funken was the first to greet me, with his students drawn up in front of his small college, which he called St. Jerome's, as I saw by the sign in front." It's at that moment that a sign had been erected by the students and Father Funken, St. Jerome's College, to honor the visit of Father Kasewitz. It's a very conscious decision on his part. Kasewitz had been responsible for establishing the mission in Canada and for supporting Louis's dream of a college. It also placed the college under the patronage of St. Jerome, a 4th century church father whose writings were to be included in the curriculum. And then we look at the curriculum and we look at the students and what they studied. Obviously, watching the clock and watching my notes, I really have to cut this short, but I want to skip to the present because I often thought that was a really interesting way to end it, and I've got a whole set of things, 2 things from the present. One is 1963, which I guess only for me is the present, because when I was here as a student. It's Father John Finn's report about being on this campus as a Roman Catholic college. His report on St. Jerome's first year on the university campus, Father John Finn recalled his delight in the relationships that had been established with the University of Waterloo and with the representatives of other religious denominations who were in the process of establishing their colleges on the campus. President Hagee, Father Finn noted, speaks of Waterloo being an interdenominational rather than a non-denominational university. Reflecting his own pleasure in this, Father Finn continued, "One of the things that has become apparent during the course of the year is that there is a quite general positive determination to cultivate harmonious relations between college and between colleges and the faculties of the university." Finn also mused about the changes that had occurred as students at St. Jerome's met so many others from different disciplines across the campus. This was the risk. How would this really work? He went on to say, whatever the ultimate outcome may be, what has happened as a natural development of the situation at Waterloo is that St. Jerome's as an enclosure within the Roman Catholic tradition could be handed on unchallenged has gone. We're not going to be unchallenged, he said. But on the other hand, there has likewise gone a large and influential public forum in which irresponsible prejudices could be advanced against the Roman Catholic faith without challenge. My personal opinion, he said, is that what has taken place is all for the good. What has happened is that the citizens of a whole university city have begun to converse about things of the Spirit in a way that was not possible a very short time ago. It was a risk. It was worth the risk. And the whole conversation of the university had changed. And he said, that's really what we're all about as a Roman Catholic university. I think maybe at that point, without pushing my luck any further, I probably should stop. I want to thank you for your attention, and I gather we'll have some time for questions, and if not, I've got lots more to say. Thank you. Sure. Is Sean and then Martin, I guess, second. Go ahead, Sean.
Well, you mentioned the facetious questions you were asked about the title. I don't want to go into that section or that heading. It's more a curiosity on my part. Knox wrote about 50 years ago about the question of enthusiasm and giving rise to, peculiar spiritual movements and even heresies. And I was wondering if that thought crossed any of the author's minds in the putting the title on the danger of using that word enthusiasm. I'll give you that question to throw in, so to speak.
Did it ever cross your mind?
No, it never crossed my mind because it never crossed Father Lewis' mind. For him, the word enthusiasm was enteos, God moving us, and that's what he's all talking about. That we seek the truth because God moves us to seek the truth. The Spirit moves us. And so I use enthusiasm. For him, I made perfect sense. Passion would have been not Jeromean. A little too dangerous.
I think in the book we actually then move from Louis' quote to his curriculum, where you can see the context in which he used that phrase. And it's also a very practical curriculum, but it's clearly combined with spirituality and practicality. But heresy, I don't think, although later on Louis is being criticized for not following quite as closely as he might some of the strictures of the church, but I don't think heresy would really fit. That's an interesting point, however. Father Vallely?
Yes, I just wanted to know, during those many years when the high school and the college were in effect indistinguishable, what would be the typical percentage of the student body that was what we would consider today to be high school students, and what would be considered college? And also, kind of at the point where it was decided to definitively separate them, even onto separate campuses, were there reasons for doing that beyond the obvious of the greater complexity of an educational system?
Okay, we'll do it in sequence.
When I was a student at St. Jerome's, I was a high school student, of course. I can't say I even knew any college students, or if there were any. But of course, that was after it had separated, and we had no knowledge of that at all. My brother, also, who was before me and was there before they had separated, he doesn't remember college students at all. But there were some. We know there were, but of a very small percentage. I was the high school student would have outnumbered them, I would say 90% to 10% in 1950. You know. But that's just a guess because they were almost invisible to high school students, or to those high school students who were there then, because I was not. I was a little later.
The other thing to note is that even when Kingsdale was up and running, that not everybody was actually a real college students. A lot of them were taking what's called the special Latin and philosophy course to get to the seminary. And so the number that would eventually get degrees in any given year would be, maybe 50-50 some years, that kind of thing. So yeah, even there you had a split.
Martin, actually in the book I took the year 1964 when they were planning their centennial, and I took the breakdown of the college, the seminary, which was then Resurrection, and St. Jerome's College here, and looked at the enrollment patterns for each of them on the grounds that I wanted to see, this was Louis's legacy 100 years later, what would he think about the size and scale of each of these institutions? But that won't tell you anything. What's happening is after the Second World War, there's this tremendous push for education, both high school and college, and so the buildings are overfilled by 1946, and they're really having to expand, and they're teaching in the nooks and crannies. But the number of college people are fairly few, and Jerry's right, because many professions, including law, accountancy, teaching, did not require a college degree. So people and at this point, St. Jerome's is caught between, it's one of the bigger issues, that Father Funken's curriculum was based on a European model, and one of the problems is it doesn't keep in touch with changes in Ontario's educational system. And so when we shut down for a point of time in 1939, I think it was because we were totally off touch with what was going on in Ontario at the university level. And when we come back in 45, there's a real attempt to bring us back into line with what's happening now in universities. So what we have to watch always is how the educational system is changing and where we fit within that. But it's always a difficult thing to measure, and as we were looking through these years, even looking at the curriculum, it's not clear. It's not clear at which point they would take those additional courses that would then put them in as college students. And some would come just for the college part, and some would actually take some high school and some college curricula, which was added on in the way that Louis had done it in the beginning. So it's something that I could never completely unravel, and I often ask myself, what does this really mean? And while we tried to make it as clear as we could, I think you can't make it black and white because it doesn't exist that way. Well, over this side first then. Yeah?
Father Jim, I've read some of, or not all of them, but some of your translations of Father Louis' letters, and he was a fascinating person, having read them, and you really got to know him. And St. Agatha, which is where I'm from, has a long tradition of our priests from the Congregation of the Resurrection, that they become very close to their community. And we have Father Charlie right now. We feel the same way about him. But I was wondering, he also had diaries, apparently, and I wondered if there was much difference between his diaries and the letters that he wrote, because I think the letters probably were pretty politically correct going back over to Rome.
Well, you're talking about Father Eugene Funken, and not Father Louis. Some of his letters going back to Rome were political, some were not. Father Louis' letters were rarely political, and they're not published yet. I hope to do that in a couple of years. Yes, there were diaries, and I have those. I've thought about publishing those too, but publishing diaries can be kind of boring because sometimes all you get is, today I have heard confessions, big deal, you know. But parts of the diary are very, very interesting. And he talks a lot about the culture of the time, you know, I think going on in St. Agatha. Of course, as you well know, Eugene is buried in St. Agatha, and now Father Louis' skull is there too. That's another story. I think it's in the book. When Father Louis died, he died, of course, in Holland, and in his will, he had said that he wanted his heart to be brought back to St. Mary's where his heart was. Well, the relatives weren't particularly happy about having his body disinterred and I guess torn up, and so he was buried there. And then years later, Father Benninger went over, and I don't know how he did it, he got the skull. And they brought back Father Louis' skull and remained in St. Mary's Parish. And I see Father Ray is already smiling because there are many stories about the skull. Fortunately, finally, several years ago, we interred it in the graveyard, under the chapel. So Father Louis and Father Eugene are close together again.
I had the impression from some of the letters that there was a little bit of contention over whether the Kentucky site should take precedence over the little backwoods one in St. Agatha, that over in Rome they had originally understood that perhaps there would be some money would be able to flow from this community back over to support the Polish congregation over in Europe, and they thought, from what I remember, they thought that the American site was more might be more provide more money. So there was a bit of contention as to whether both of them could actually stay alive, and I got the impression that Father Funkin was worried that his Canadian site might not survive.
Well, that's true. The St. Mary's, of course, was taken over by the Resurrectionists in 1871, and of course by that time Father Louis had moved the college to the Duke Street area, and he was concerned. He was concerned because his biggest concern, and you'll see some of the letters that Father Eugene writes, you'll see more of it in Father Louis' letters. He was concerned that the students that he graduated, like Theobald Spetz and all these people, would go to Rome and then either wouldn't come back or would go to St. Mary's. And he fought tooth and nail to get his boys back, which is one of the reasons why he was sometimes at odds with the authorities in Rome, because he really, he fought very differently. It's what Father Eugene, as a matter of fact. They wanted their boys back here. But there was concern about what would happen with St. Mary's, being a rival.
When the university was first federated, Waterloo College was also invited to that federation. What happened to that?
That's another book which I've written. But the short answer is they chose not to federate. They chose not to federate because they feared losing their Lutheran identity within a larger university. That's really the reason. It was the Synod's decision, spurred on by 7 or 8 faculty members, all of whom were Lutheran ministers. And the irony is that, of course, Waterloo Lutheran doesn't exist any longer, and they have become Wilfrid Laurier University. Although the Lutheran Seminary exists, the Lutheran Church's role in that university is non-existent. And that's what happened. And Father Siegfried took the gamble. You could better preserve your identity within the larger institution, and that was a risk either way. The Lutheran Synod went one way. The Lutheran Board, however, was against the Synod. The Synod overruled its own Board of Governors, and it's a really fascinating story which I can't do justice to tonight. But it had to do with a loss of religious identity. And in the St. Jerome's book, I suggest at one point that Bishop Ryan and the Lutheran Synod had more in common than Father Siegfried did with, and Father Siegfried and President Hagee were going one way, and the Synod and the Bishop, for the very same reasons, religious identity, were pushing for more independent institutions. Tricky question, though. And the community was badly split over it. And for $34.92, I can even sell you the book. Could Father Valley raise funds to buy the book? And then he'd know. This is just a teaser to tell you to go and buy the book from Harry outside. Bishop Bryan was honored by this university. And there are some unpublished tidbits where his name had disappeared from the calendar when a certain dean standing beside me was angry with the bishop at one point.
Let me tell that one right here.
He wants to tell it now. It's not in the book, so I don't know if it's true.
It's true.
Okay, go ahead.
The Bishop Bryan came up to St. Jerome's, visit St. Jerome's, and it was the first and only time we had seen him. I was dean, and the idea was he would have a liturgy at Notre Dame Chapel, which was, and then afterwards we had dinner with the priest, and then afterwards we come back to Notre Dame residence, and there would be a kind of a full pit session, and people would ask questions. Well, at the Mass, his homily was about giving to Catholic education. He's talking to students who hadn't got any money, so I didn't like that very much. Dinner went fine, I think, but then we came back for the session with the students. Bishop Bryan said, "Now, Father, I want you to sit this side, and Father Burkheim on the other side." Okay, so we're sitting there. First question, I knew it was going to happen. What about the pill? Bishop Bryan turns to me and said, "Father, you can handle that." I just said, "Well, obviously you read Humani Vitae, and exactly what is in the pill is what we believe." And just, well, that was fine. The whole rest of the session went downhill from there. That was fine. But then I found out later on that he had gone to Mac University the next day and said that he had been put to the ringer at St. Jerome's College. That annoyed me so much. I took the name out the masthead of chancellor. No one ever noticed it. I don't think he knew it either.
Maybe I have one quick one too then. Father Norman Choate, when he was chaplain, decided he wanted to, getting involved with students, and he invited students to play guitar at Mass. Bishop Bryan sent a letter to every priest in the diocese denouncing Father Choate for allowing the guitar to be used in a liturgical service. So I guess those are two. We left his name on the masthead that year.
When I was trying to do a biography of Bishop Bryan, there's a perfect picture that sums up his episcopacy, I think. And there's going to be a cover of the book. And he's being given a free Cadillac Fairview, the big one anyway, the great big boat. And they're handing him the keys free of charge. And the title of the book was going to be The Last of the Cadillac Bishops. Yeah.
I have one question. I'm sorry I got here late. I had another commitment. Could you answer, for my sake, and maybe for some other people in the audience, does St. Jerome's campus extend across the highway, Westmount, to where the retirement home and also where the new area is? And the second part of that question is, if so, what was the thinking on building single-family dwellings rather than putting up a retirement home for Catholics in the area? Because there is no place, to my knowledge, for Catholics like there is for our friends down the street, the Lutherans. And secondly, the land was there that could have been used, and it was supported by the people in the area. Now, it may be out to lunch at this forum to get into that.
Well, number one,
yeah.
The St. Jerome's property does not extend across the way. We're completely separate, distinct.
Mm-hmm.
That decision to use the property as it was made by the Congregation of the Resurrection, and that is completely separate from us at all, completely.
Right. So at another forum.
I would think so, yeah.
Thanks very much for trying.
If not, you are, of course, welcome to stay as usual. And mill at the back, there is coffee, and there is the usual display of cookies and juices and things of that sort. And the three speakers will be glad to join you at the back if you'd like to chat more informally, if you don't like to ask questions in a public forum. The book is also available at the back of the room. It is $32 plus tax, and I'm told the tax is $2.24. So that's $34.24 if you'd like to get a copy of the book and get it signed by the authors and make a great Christmas present. Many of us went to St. Jerome's Some of us older fellows went both to the high school and to the college and got a degree from both places. Also at the back you'll find that there is fair trade organic coffee, chocolate tea and the like. Please support the cause for fair agricultural development. There's a sign-up sheet if you'd like to order a tape of tonight's presentation or any presentation at the center from the past 20 years. They are $10 each, which is essentially our cost. There's a sign-up at the back, and you may feel free. The tape will be available within a week. Also, if you'd like to be on the mailing list and you're not, there is a sign-up sheet at the back. And if you'd like also to sign up, if you're not on our email list, we will keep you up to date with upcoming material. I'd like to thank Carol Person for organizing the events at the back, and for her husband Ivan for running around doing the AV stuff. That's my work at the hospital. Give me another 2 years and you can do the IV stuff. And Harry Frockledge, who is taking photographs and also selling books at the back. Our next center event will not take place till 2003, and on Friday, January 24, John Della Costa will provide a timely presentation on theology for business leaders. We hope to see you there. And Jerry Stortz, if you would provide a formal thank you, and you've got the last word.
Several years ago, I got a letter from a mutual friend, Sean Brown, and it said that Ken McLaughlin embodies style and substance, a combination that's far too rare. And let me say that in the 31 years I've known Ken, every dealing I've had with him has featured both style and substance, and tonight is no exception. I'm particularly impressed because this is the third presentation on St. Jerome's history he's done this year. The one at St. Michael's that he mentioned at the Learned Societies, the one at the St. Jerome's Feast, and then again tonight. And each one has been different, and this last one was actually done in the literally few days since he's returned from a trip to Europe with Liz. Second thing is, the book itself is very different from most illustrated histories, because what we did, and this was Ken's initiative, was to analyze photographs rather than just identify them or make them ornaments. And so, Ken, I thank you for tonight. It was informative and entertaining, and I appreciate it very much. And I'd like to thank everybody here tonight for coming on a cold night this close to Christmas. Thank you.